Welcome back to the world of Eichard, where we learn how to think like the College Board. Today, we're covering topics 6.4 and 6.5. Here's the required content from 6.4, Global Economy. As industrialization spread and intensified, and as the technology became ever more complex, there was an ever longer list of raw materials needed. Industrialization also fueled urbanization, with cities around the world seeing explosive population growth, which created a huge demand for imported food. Many societies around the world developed economies that specialized in exporting commodities. Commodities are raw materials. That includes food, industrial crops such as cotton, and minerals. These commodities were then traded with industrialized societies in exchange for manufactured finished goods. Sometimes the local people in these societies made profits, but more often the real money still made its way into the hands of the industrialists and imperialists. This leads us into 6.5, Economic Imperialism. Trade in commodities was organized in a way that gave merchants and companies in Europe and the US a distinct economic advantage. We saw in 6.2 how Africa and parts of Asia became colonies under direct control of imperial powers. These colonies were often transformed by the imperialists into producers of commodities, permanently altering their economies, social structures, and environments. But even in the regions that remained politically independent, specifically Latin America and China, they still fell victim to economic imperialism. The more powerful industrialized states used their power to enforce unequal treaties, which benefited European and American businesses. And it was often these American and European businesses that owned the mines where valuable metals were extracted and the farms where food commodities were produced. Let's start with cotton, a commodity we've discussed before. As Britain's textile industry intensified, demand for raw cotton soared. We already saw in 5.6 how Egypt under Muhammad Ali turned into an export economy based on the commodity of raw cotton. And here it is again as an example in 6.4. But we also saw how the Egyptians failed to become an industrial producer of cotton products. And one of the reasons was because many European businesses and governments did not want other regions to industrialize. It was extremely profitable to buy unfinished raw materials, commodities, and then sell finished products back to the non-industrialized societies. This is what we mean by trade in commodities giving Europeans and Americans a distinct economic advantage, which is why cotton is also an example here in 6.5. The British protected their industrial technology with patents and other laws protecting private property, and they actively discouraged the spread of this technology outside of Britain. The most extreme example of Britain's exploitation of the cotton commodity market was in India. Before the Industrial Revolution, India was the world's leading exporter of finished cotton products, which were made by artisans on hand looms. But by the end of the 19th century, India's exports of finished textile products had plummeted, and it was instead transformed into the leading exporter of raw cotton to the British. One reason was that local Indian cotton producers could not compete with Britain's low-price industrial textiles made using the factory system. Another reason was imperialism. The British East India Company, and later the British Raj, passed laws that made it illegal to make cotton clothing in India. As the company expanded, it displaced small rice farmers and compelled them to work on massive cotton-growing plantations. And it sold this raw cotton back to factories in Britain. So British companies were profiting both from exporting raw cotton from India and manufactured cotton products from Britain? Yes, that's how it worked. Now let's look at rubber. The late 19th and early 20th centuries saw a boom in the demand for rubber, which is used to make tires, shoes, and many other things. We've already seen how this affected people in the Belgian-controlled Congo, where the local population was forced to harvest the material, and where millions died in the process. In addition to the immediate deaths and suffering, long-term economic and social consequences included a loss of diversity in economic and labor activity, as people who used to do other things, farming, artisan work, and metal crafting, were forcibly swallowed up into the single-minded focus of rubber extraction. But for the nation of Belgium, and Belgian companies like the Abir Congo Company, this was extremely profitable. A similar process occurred in the Amazon in South America, another rich rubber-producing region. Indigenous communities were forced into debt peonage, a process where people who can't pay their debts are forced to labor in exchange. Like in the Congo, this was often enforced through violence. And American companies like Goodyear benefited from the increased supply of rubber, which it used to manufacture tires and other things. Now, palm oil. Palm oil production became became prevalent throughout sub-Saharan Africa, including the British Gold Coast colony. Profits from exporting palm oil were used to purchase finished products from the industrialized world, as well as to build railroads and telegraph lines. But here as well we can see the decline of a diversity of other kinds of economic activity. And European businesses and merchants benefited most? Right again. The most famous company was British and Dutch conglomerate Unilever, which is one of the College Board's examples of a transnational company from 5.7. Now let's talk about metals. Precious metals like silver and gold continued to be important in the global economy, and Latin America remained an important source. And as the second industrial revolution intensified and electricity became more prevalent, demand for copper and other metals increased. Nations like Mexico and Chile saw a large amount of foreign investment in the mining industry, which brought benefits like railroads and telegraphs, but which also meant an increasing amount of economic imperialism. It was often Americans and Europeans who owned the mines. They also owned a lot of other stuff, like cattle ranches, factories, and most of the railroads. One telling statistic is that by 1910, American individuals and businesses owned 25% of the land in Mexico. Our final commodity to discuss is opium, and the story begins with the British East India Company. Them again. I know, right? Remember back in 4.5 when we talked about the global silver trade and how all the silver ended up in China because everybody wanted to buy their luxury goods, but the Chinese didn't want to buy anybody else's stuff? Yeah, we remember. Well, as the British East India Company was expanding in South Asia, it wasn't just establishing cotton plantations. It was also growing poppies and turning them into opium. Now here was a product that was finally able to be sold to the Chinese market, meaning that the British didn't have to keep giving all their silver to buy porcelain and tea. Opium addiction was a well-known problem, but when the Chinese official Lin Zexu tried to take a stand and stop the opium trade, the British responded in what is now known as the First Opium War, which ended with a decisive British victory and the Treaty of Nanking. This treaty was the first of many unequal treaties, which granted the British great advantages and which further weakened the Qing dynasty. Britain was given control over Hong Kong and access to important ports such as Shanghai. Reminds me of HSBC. Yes, if you recall, HSBC, Hong Kong and Shanghai Banking Corporation, was formed as a direct result of the Opium Wars. The Second Opium War began and ended similarly, except this one included both Britain and France. More unequal treaties were signed. Concession ports were granted to industrial powers, including many European countries, the United States, and Japan. Foreign merchants could operate here without the usual legal restrictions from the Qing government, and could even commit crimes and not be prosecuted in China, a concept known as extraterritoriality. And the sale of opium continued and intensified, with disastrous effects on the society of Qing China. But I reckon it was good for HSBC. Yes, it was immensely profitable for them and for many of the other European and American businesses operating in China. We'll finish up by talking about some of the other consequences associated with global economy and economic imperialism. Let's start with social effects. We saw in 5.9 how the industrial nations experienced profound social changes with the creation of new social classes and the decline of artisans. The export economies of 6.4 likewise saw a social transformation as their economies adapted to the new global economic system. People who had worked in traditional industries such as cotton weavers in India or blacksmiths in sub-Saharan Africa were made increasingly irrelevant and forced to find work in mines or the plantations that produce the ever more important export commodities. Small peasant farms and indigenous communal-owned land was swallowed up by large landowners, including Americans and Europeans, but also local elites as well. Many people in Latin America went into debt peonage and were forced to work in conditions similar to slavery. The environmental impact was enormous. The cash crops grown for export required the use of intensive agriculture, which led to degradation of the soil and deforestation to accommodate ever larger farms and ranches. The practice of monoculture, where only a single crop species is grown, can be profitable and efficient if it works out, but if that crop fails, the region can be devastated. In British India, for example, there were many famines that were at least partly caused by the decline in diversity of agriculture and the emphasis on cotton and opium cultivation. The mining industry has many environmental impacts, including polluting local rivers and soils, and road and railroad construction required further deforestation and disruption of local ecosystems. And now we are done with 6.4 and 6.5. We'll see you next time to talk about migration. Like and subscribe if you want to get a 5.